We've been warned we have about a decade to really get our act together and stop sitting on our hands. We have to take decisive and substantial action now, not in 10 years or 20 years. We have to act now.
Der australische Agrarökonom Tony Rinaudo leitet seit Anfang der 1980er Jahre diverse Hilfsprogramme in Afrika. Insbesondere engagiert er sich für die Wiederaufforstung. Für seinen unermüdlichen Einsatz erhielt er 2018 den Alternativen Nobelpreis. Nun liegt seine Autobiografie Unsere Bäume der Hoffnung vor. Julian Quentin spricht mit Tony Rinaudo über seine Erfahrungen.
Tony, thank you so much for joining us from Australia over Zoom, given to these extraordinary circumstances. The first question that would interest me is that in 1981 you moved to Niger from Australia with your family, and as an agriculturalist, what kind of situation did you find? How would you describe the situation in Niger at that time?
Thank you, Julian. It's a pleasure to be with you. The landscape was at a point of ecological collapse, barely able to support life. And I guess in the 20 to 30 years prior to my arrival, over that period, what had been a biodiverse dryland forest had been almost completely cleared of trees. And because of that destruction, the wind speeds increased to 60 to 70 kilometers per hour at planting time. So you can imagine the abrasion on the emerging seedlings and even being buried by sand, very high soil temperatures, and extremely infertile soil, very sandy soil. And when you remove the trees, it loses its fertility. And then in addition, even in the years when it did rain, because you've lost your biodiversity, and you plant virtually a monoculture, mainly millet, their main food source, then it's an invitation for every description of insect pest to come to the feast. And so even in a good year, it's very difficult for people to grow enough food. So it was quite discouraging, really. And at that stage, I was still quite young. I didn't have any experience. What on earth am I going to do here?
Okay, that's quite interesting. The thing that you mentioned about these monocultures, I think that there are so many charities around the world that are, like collecting money to plant trees. And, a lot of them actually also did in the beginning. But my question is, why did so many other charities fail?
Well, certainly not all fail, but particularly as you go into the harsher environments. For example, where I lived in West Africa, it's extremely difficult to succeed with tree planting. Combating the goats is very difficult. If you don't provide fencing, and no project, no matter how well funded, no project can provide sufficient fencing for the extent of deforestation globally. So if you don't provide fencing, then you have to use local materials, and goats can always find a way through that. Drought, termites, locusts, you name it, if something could go wrong, it will go wrong. And so it's not necessarily a reflection on these organizations planting trees, but you really do have the odds stacked against you. Another big issue is getting commitment and ownership on the part of the community. So often people are desperately poor, they're struggling to survive, and tree planting, if anything, is a distraction. And in people's minds, it might take 10, 15 years to get a benefit from these trees, and very difficult for them to think that far into the future when they're trying to put food on the table today. But as I said at the start, there are exceptions and some very well-designed projects that do succeed.
Well, that's great to hear. But I mean, after all of these challenges and all of these obstacles, you made a momentous discovery to kind of combat a lot of these issues. And how did that come about?
Well, I'd like to call it a rediscovery because in reality, there's nothing new in what I do. Many tree species, maybe most species, when you cut them down, they don't die. They have the capacity to re-sprout from the stump. And in fact, if you go back in history, centuries, on many continents, people have been practicing one form of this tree management, one form or another, across many continents. And it's a practice in many regions, but particularly in parts of Africa, that's been lost. And so for me, I hit a point in my time in Niger, maybe 2.5 years into my time there. I was very, very discouraged because I'd given my best effort to tree planting. I tried everything, exotic species, indigenous species, planting as soon as the rain starts, planting before the rainy season, but with extra assistance. I tried everything and nothing worked in a sustainable, economically viable way. And so as a young person, I was very energetic, very enthusiastic to do something. I thought, this is hopeless, waste of time, waste of money, better to go home. But I did feel called. I did feel I was meant to be there, and there must be a solution. And as it turned out, one day, as I was driving to the villages, and I had a load of tree seedlings for planting on the vehicle and in the trailer being pulled by the vehicle, and I had to stop in order to reduce the air pressure. If you don't do that in sandy soil, you get bogged. And as I stood there and I was looking in all directions, north, south, east, west, barely a tree on the horizon, and I was thinking, hopeless, useless. But I'm a person of faith, and I shot up a quick prayer and I said, please forgive us for destroying the gift of your creation. And as a consequence of that destruction, people are suffering. They're hungry, they're poor, they don't know what to do. But you still love us. Open our eyes, show us what to do. And honestly, that was the turning point. I had been on this road for nearly 2.5 years, almost weekly, my eyes open, but totally blind to what had been there the whole time. In that landscape, there are millions of what seem to be bushes, just everywhere. And then each year in preparation for planting, these bushes get slashed and burnt because the perception is that a clean farmer is a good farmer. A farm with no trees is a good farm. And on this day, one of these bushes caught my attention, and I took the trouble to just walk over and take a closer look. And as soon as I saw the leaf, everything changed. Wow. A leaf of a tree is like a signature. And I realized instantly that's not a bush, it's not a useless desert weed, that's a tree. It's been cut down, it re-sprouts, and every year gets slashed again. So it never becomes a tree again. And in that instant, for me, everything changed. And I realized that was the answer to prayer that I was looking for. And I was no longer fighting the Sahara Desert. It wasn't a question of having a super species of tree that could withstand the harsh conditions or multi-millions of dollars, because literally everything that you needed for reforestation was at your feet. And so the battle lines shifted. No longer fighting the desert, it was a question of battling false beliefs about trees and the environment, negative attitudes, and destructive behavior. And so that was the start of the change.
Wow, that's a really interesting story. But I mean, the thing that really baffles me is that this solution seems so simple, you know, and so much less complicated. So I just wonder, like, why did nobody else discover that beforehand? Or you said it was a rediscovery, so it has been there before, but like, why wasn't this widely adopted before you?
Well, to be truthful, even today as I travel to very remote areas, there are many local villagers who've discovered this for themselves and developed their own techniques at it. And there are countries where it's still practiced, but I think our minds get on a certain track, and it's very hard to deviate. And so my perception was this was a treeless landscape. The only solution that I was familiar with, and the solution that everybody else was doing, the government, other NGOs, major donors, they're all planting trees. And so you give it all you got. You try harder. You try better. And instead of stepping outside of your worldview, your approach to things, and trying to look at things differently, you just try harder and try again and again and again. So really, I was very fortunate that day that I was discouraged and ready to give up, and that bush got my attention.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you talked about this beforehand a little bit, talking about mindset and, about all of these farmers that have been cutting down these bushes and, kind of like you're saying of a clean farmer is a good farmer. So, because, they were regarded as obstacles in their fields. And I'm wondering, how did you manage to convince them not to cut them down, but to leave them standing? How did you kind of convince them to look for this kind of really long-term future?
Mm-hmm. Well, there was also the fact that the trees didn't legally belong to the farmers. And in fact, they were a liability. If a tree got cut down on your land, you could be fined for that loss. So it wasn't just that they were in the habit of cutting them down to be clean farmers. How did we convince them? Actually, it was very, very difficult. And for a period, they called me the crazy white farmer. Who, in their right mind, would leave trees on their good farmland, especially when you consider that we're regularly hungry? It was crazy. And so I had to start with just a handful of individuals. We worked in 10 villages, and I had 1 or 2 volunteers per village. And I said, look, I think this will work. I'm not sure. I think it will work. Would you agree to experiment on one small corner of your land? If it doesn't work, no problem. You can cut them down and go back to what you did before. But if it does work, let's see where this experiment takes us. That was 1983. And it worked very well. Within 6 months, you could see the rapid growth of the stems coming from the stumps. It was very, very impressive. But for a variety of reasons, sometimes out of need, out of jealousy, out of spite, other people would come and they would cut these trees down. And the whole experiment could have failed in 1983 if it wasn't for what happened later that year. That year there was a terrible drought. And so for the next season, people's crops failed. And they had no food in 1984. And this gave me the opportunity. We were able to access food, and we developed a Food for Work program. So one of the work requirements, if you're going to receive monthly allotment of grain from us, one of the work requirements is we want you to regenerate 40 trees per hectare. Now, many people thought, Tony, he's so mean. He's forcing us to grow trees on our good agricultural land. But they were hungry. I had a captive audience, and they complied, at least for that first part of 1984. And the results were amazing. The trees grew maybe 500,000 trees across 100 villages. And that year we had excellent rains, and fortunately the crops produced a lot of grain. There was a bumper harvest. And so there was no negative impact of the trees. Mm-hmm. Now, amazingly, maybe 75% of the trees got cut out as soon as we stopped giving grain. But 25% 25% of the farmers said, no, Tony's crazy, but this method did not hurt us. We still got grain, lots of grain. We have a little bit of shade. We have fuel wood. Some of these trees produce fruit, medicine, fodder. We're going to go for another year and see where this takes us. So that early adopters, that core group, persevered. And they went another year, no negative impact, lots of benefits. They went another year, no negative impact, more benefits. And from that core group, the message spread from farmer to farmer. And even though I was active, we had trainings, we had visits, we did all sorts of things. The main the main mechanism of spreading this method was simply farmers talking to farmers. It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, just within their peer group as well. So kind of speaking in a more general way, what contributions do you think the FMNR methods can make? And where do you also think are its limits?
Well, if you take Niger alone, and today there are more than 6 million hectares of FMNR practiced by farmers in Niger, possibly 240 million trees without planting a single one of them, all regeneration. So that's just Niger. And if you think in West Africa, there are about 21 million hectares, and then there are many other countries where they're doing this. But let's just look at Niger. As a result of that restoration, farmers in Niger are growing an additional 500,000 tons of grain per year without extra fertilizer or better seed or irrigation, simply because the microclimate has improved. Lower temperature, lower wind speed, more fertile soil, greater protection by natural predators, insect-eating birds, lizards and so on, eat the pests. Just because of bringing back the trees, there's enough food every year to feed, I think it's 2.5 million people. Gross income, because of those trees every year, is in the order of nearly $1 billion directly to the farmer. The value of what they consume directly, plus the surplus that they sell, worth nearly $1 billion. And keep in mind, Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world, and there's no ongoing aid, there's no ongoing project encouraging people to do this. They do it because it's become normalized. So there are many, many impacts. And as I travel around the world, I see regions where water springs have revived, fodder's available for livestock. People who had to walk for 4 hours to get their fuel wood now have easy access and a surplus, a new source of income. People can now keep beehives, another source of income and food, wild foods, medicines. And then you can think about, well, what about climate change? All of these trees are drawing in carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locking it up. And you multiply this effort across millions of hectares, it adds up significantly.
So, also regarding climate change, do you think that there are also really simple solutions like this for other climate-related issues?
Well, certainly, if you look at this one, it's a no-brainer. It's a low-hanging fruit that you can implement immediately. There are an estimated, at least a minimum of 2 billion hectares of degraded land where some degree of this type of restoration might be possible. There are an additional 2 billion hectares of degraded farmland where, again, you could have some degree of increased tree cover using this method, and certainly tree planting as well. Other methods, probably one of the biggest untapped areas of potential is simply more sustainable approaches to agriculture, not ploughing the soil, because a lot of carbon dioxide is released when you cultivate the soil. Growing more perennials. So much of our food comes from annual crops, and there's a lot of mechanization required and so forth. with perennials, they're locking up carbon for much of the year, and there's much less machinery used and so on to manage it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so you're talking about agriculture and kind of processes within agriculture. Maybe a bit of a more general question: what factors do you think are important, for a movement to emerge and become this successful? And what can my generation do?
Well, in the case of FMNR, there was certainly a strong factor was need. That people could not go on in the way that they were. They had a choice. Once we discovered FMNR, they had a choice. Continue as you are and be forced off your land by hunger and poverty, or adopt practices like this and increase the productivity and have a much better life. And I believe with climate change, we have a choice. There are many things we can do. We can reduce emissions, and that really must be the first step. What we're consuming and emitting, it's relatively easy to make lots of cuts in that area, in transport, in the source of our electricity and so on. And then proactive things. Join a tree planting group. Things aren't coming to mind immediately, but there are many things that we can do, and it disturbs me often when I speak to large groups. Often I find people are very fearful of the future, and it's like they retreat into their shell. Woe is me, there's nothing I can do. Nothing could be further from the truth. Even if all you can do is turn the light switch off when you leave the room, that is within your power. And nearly all of us are capable of doing much more than turning a light switch off.
So you think it's not too late?
Oh, I'm an optimist, and it's definitely not too late. When you think one idea, FMNR, changed the dynamics. For decades, there had been almost total failure to halt desertification. One idea changed the whole dynamic. And if we see these types of innovations in energy production, transport, and all the other things that are causing climate change, the situation can change very quickly. However, time is of the essence. We've been warned we have about a decade to really get our act together and stop sitting on our hands. We have to take decisive and substantial action now, not in 10 years or 20 years. We have to act now.
Wow, thank you very much. So what kind of projects are you currently working on, and what are your goals with them?
So I'm a staff member in World Vision, and we have many field projects across the world, most in Africa, but also in Asian countries, and in the near future we hope in Latin America as well. And most of these are working with communities to restore degraded lands, including agricultural land, grazing land, and degraded forests. So it's not only agricultural land, as was the case in Niger. But we have projects in Ethiopia, for example, where whole forests have been restored. And they're very exciting. You can just see the region coming to life, and the restoration of hope in people's lives. People who'd given up and were going to the cities, they now have something to live on and something to live for in their own communities. So I work with my colleagues in World Vision on many projects, but I also work beyond World Vision. There's a very strong group, the Global Evergreening Alliance. So it's an alliance of non-government organizations, research institutions, educational institutions, and so on, that's working together to promote methods like FMNR at scale. So we're not just looking at a particular community or a particular district, but whole regions of continents.
Wow! So a lot of great visions for the future then.
I think so. I wouldn't be able to keep going if I didn't have hope. And the wonderful thing is that as you move forward with activities like this, you discover there are many, many other people, like-minded people out there. And the more you work together with others and other organizations, the more that is possible.
Thank you so much for this very inspiring conversation. And I wish you a lovely day in Australia.
Thank you.
Or evening.
Thank you, Tony. It's a great pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wenn Sie mehr erfahren möchten über Tony Rinaudos Leben und Wirken sowie die FMNR-Methode, so empfehle ich Ihnen die Autobiografie Unsere Bäume der Hoffnung.